Okay, let's dive into this. There's a new poll out, and honestly, it throws a bit of a curveball, doesn't it? About how Canadians are thinking.
hmm About their head of state and even, well, bigger picture stuff.
Exactly. It definitely got me thinking, especially with all the noise sometimes coming from down south.
It really highlights, I think, how Canadians perceive their own identity, especially when you ask these kinds of hypothetical questions.
Right. So this is our deep dive into that poll. It was done by Jane L. Partners for dailymail.com. And the plan here is really to understand the feelings behind the numbers.
Not just the what, but the why.
Yeah. Why are these preferences? Who do they want leading? Where do they see themselves fitting in? We want to get the core insights, without drowning in stats.
And it really touches on these deep roots, history, culture, that relationship with the U.S. It's fascinating stuff.
Okay, so the headline that first grabbed me, King Charles III versus Donald Trump as head of state. Canadians preferred the king, 54%.
Right, compared to only 15% for Trump.
That's a pretty wide margin, wouldn't you
No,
think?
absolutely, a substantial difference. And it gets even more pronounced when you look at party affiliations.
Okay.
Well, among liberal supporters, it's huge. 76% for King Charles, only 4% for Trump.
Wow. Okay.
And the NDP, the New Democrats, pretty similar. 65% favoring the king, just 8% for Trump.
So strong preference there. But what about the conservatives? I was curious about that.
Yeah, that's where it gets, well, a bit more nuanced. King Charles still leads, but it's much closer. 37% for the king versus 31% for Trump.
So even there, the monarch edges him out. That's interesting.
It is, isn't it? It suggests that even for voters who might align with, say, some Republican ideas, that symbolic link to the crown, it still carries weight for quite a few.
Yeah, that traditional tie. And we should mention,
Yeah.
pretty big chunk, 31% said don't know, which this poll came after Trump had made some comments about Canada.
Right.
Exactly. And that don't know could mean a few things. Maybe genuine uncertainty on a weird question, or maybe just not wanting to choose between those two specifically, or perhaps neither feels like the right fit for Canada,
That makes sense. Okay, now hold on. The next finding is the one that really kind of blew my mind a bit.
Okay.
They asked Canadians, would you rather rejoin the British Empire or become the 51st U.S. state?
And
An incredible 82% said they'd prefer to go back to the empire.
82. Wow.
Yeah. Only 18% opted for becoming the 51st state.
That's a stark result. It speaks volumes, really, about how Canadians see their sovereignty, their history.
It's not just nostalgia, is it?
I don't think so. It likely points to a very strong desire to maintain a separate Canadian identity, maybe a less politically entangled relationship than full integration with the U.S. would imply.
A symbolic link versus becoming part of the whole U.S. system.
Perhaps, yeah. And it seems more comfortable for them.
And this wasn't just one group thinking this way, right? It cut across party lines.
That's the other striking thing. Yes, across all parties, even among conservatives, who you might think, well, even 68% of them preferred rejoining the empire.
68%.
Yeah.
Compared to 32% who'd choose becoming a U.S. state.
It really shows how powerful that idea of a distinct Canadian identity is, trumping typical political divides in this specific scenario.
Okay, so why? Why these strong preferences? The poll doesn't spell it out, but we can probably connect some dots, right?
Well, you'd have to assume Trump's history plays a role. Things like the trade arguments, questioning NATO.
His immigration stance, maybe?
Could be. Things that likely didn't sit well with many Canadians.
And then there were Trump's own comments about Canada joining the U.S., promising lower taxes, better security.
Right. But it seems for most Canadians, those potential perks just don't outweigh the desire to stay, well, Canadian.
Plus, you had Prime Minister Mark Carney saying very clearly, Canada will never be part of the U.S. That probably resonated.
A strong statement like that from leadership certainly reinforces the sentiment.
And maybe even, cultural things, like hockey fans booing the U.S. anthem sometimes. It seems small, but maybe it hints at something deeper.
Those cultural markers often do reflect underlying feelings about national identity, yeah. The perceived differences.
So, bottom line on joining the U.S., it's basically a non-starter for Canadians. The poll showed 69% strongly oppose it.
And another 4% somewhat oppose. That's nearly 3/4 against.
Yeah, versus only, 6% strongly supporting and 8% somewhat supporting. It's just not on the table for them.
No. It paints a very, very clear picture. a deep resistance to being absorbed politically by the U.S. It underlines that sense of Canada being its own distinct project.
Right, even with all the closeness and cultural overlap.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's a little side point that could have implications for U.S. politics. If Canada did join,
Hypothetically speaking.
yeah, purely hypothetically, they asked which U.S. party Canadians would lean towards. 43% said Democrat. Only 18% said Republican.
Interesting. So adding Canada could, theoretically, shift the balance in the U.S. Congress, probably favoring the Democrats.
Yeah.
And that might also perhaps feed back into why some Canadians prefer a monarch focused on things like conservation, climate change, issues often more aligned with Democrats.
Then a president with different priorities. Makes sense.
It could be part of the calculation for some.
And there were a couple of other kind of quirky findings too, right, about specific people.
Yes, they asked about Elon Musk.
What about him?
A majority, 55%, actually think Canada should strip him of his citizenship.
Really? Only 19% were opposed to that.
That's what the poll found. And they also asked about Wayne Gretzky.
The great one. What about him?
Apparently 20% of Canadians think he should move back to the U.S.
Huh. Okay, that feels a bit random, maybe. But interesting that they asked.
It just adds a bit more color to how Canadians view certain U.S.-related figures and issues, often with a critical eye, it seems.
So let's try and wrap this up. The big takeaways seem pretty cool.
Yeah.
Canadians definitely prefer King Charles over Donald Trump as head of state. That's one.
A clear preference, yeah.
And maybe even more surprising, they'd much rather rejoin the British Empire than become the 51st U.S. state. Like, overwhelmingly so.
Right, and that preference holds strong across different groups within Canada.
It really hammers home how strong and distinct that Canadian identity feels, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It shows how much history, culture, and that desire for sovereignty matter in public opinion, especially when you live next door to such a powerful neighbor.
Yeah. It really makes you wonder, how does this shape things going forward? You know, the Canada-U.S. relationship, policy talks. And what does that pull towards the symbolic monarchy, that historical link, really say about what a country values in the 21st century, particularly when compared to its very dominant neighbor?
That's the question, isn't it? Definitely something to mull over.